Can you believe that for centuries, the most terrifying villain in Europe was not a marauding Viking horde, nor a monstrous dragon, nor a tyrannical king? No, the true, silent killer that stalked the cobblestone paths and mud tracks of 12th century France was something far more primal, far more insidious. It was a catastrophe no one saw coming, year after year, yet it claimed more lives than any battlefield execution. We're talking about the year 1100 CE, a time when the world was perpetually damp, perpetually shadowed, and under the iron boot of the feudal system.
Forget everything you think you know about hardship. This was not merely uncomfortable. This was existence balanced on the razor edge of absolute zero. Imagine stepping outside your miserable thatch-roofed hovel and knowing that every breath you took was a roll of the dice against hypothermia, against the diseases that the icy grip brought with it.
This story is about the most desperate, heartbreaking, and frankly, shocking solution that the forgotten people of France, the peasants, devised to cheat death. It's the story of the shared hearth, a forced intimacy that saved thousands of lives but shattered countless souls. Welcome to the small, miserable fiefdom of Saint-Denis-les-Mours, nestled deep within the unforgetting lands controlled by the ruthless Lord Berard. Here, the land was hard, the taxes were endless, and the winter, when it arrived, was a supernatural force designed specifically to extinguish human life. The chronicles of the time, scrawled in freezing ink by terrified monks, rarely mentioned the true struggle of the serf. They talked of crusades and royal marriages, but the real high-stakes drama was happening right here, on the filthy dirt floor of a crowded, smoky cottage. Picture this. November descends like a lead curtain. The meager harvest is already gone, snatched up by the Lord's collectors before the first frost even hit. The single communal fire pit in the center of the hut, the very heart of their meager world, is sputtering, starved for wood they dare not steal from the Lord's forbidden forest. They knew what was coming. If two families tried to survive the winter separately, they would both perish. The fuel consumption was too high, the stored body heat too low. The math was brutal, unforgiving, and dictated a single, horrifying truth: merge or die. So began the great involuntary migration. Families, entire bloodlines, who usually kept their distance, wary of the proximity and the inevitable spread of fever, were forced together, shoulder to shoulder, into spaces never meant to hold so many breathing bodies. A single peasant hut, typically housing 5 people, suddenly became a crowded, boiling cauldron of human despair, holding 15, sometimes 20 people, ranging from infants to centenarians. Their goal? To generate enough collective metabolic heat to ward off the encroaching frost demon. Can you imagine the terror Not just the physical cold outside, but the claustrophobic mental terror inside, where privacy died, and every whispered argument, every cough, every hungry moan was heard by everyone else fighting for the same sliver of warmth. The air was thick, heavy, and poisonous, a vile mixture of peat smoke, unwashed bodies, stale breath, and the odor of fear. There were no windows, just gaps covered by oiled animal skins, barely keeping the wind out. The only light came from that dying central fire, casting dancing skeletal shadows on the packed mud walls. But the desperation went deeper. The sharing of warmth wasn't just about huddling together. It meant sharing the last, infinitesimal scraps of food, knowing that if one person starved, the heat they contributed would be lost, potentially dooming the rest. It was a macabre, living game theory. The needs of the collective instantly superseded the needs of the individual. If an elderly grandmother was ill, was she still worth the food and space she consumed? These were the savage, unspoken calculations played out every single night beneath the icy gaze of the feudal moon. The parents tried to shield their children from the brutal reality, singing desperate, tuneless lullabies. But the cold crept into their bones, a chilling whisper telling them that their warmth was finite. And soon, someone's body would have to pay the ultimate price to keep the others alive. And yet, this primal survival mechanism, this pact of the damned, created an entirely new type of drama. A drama of microscopic betrayal, of petty theft under the cover of darkness, and the agonizing question: when your neighbor's life is literally keeping you from freezing, how long can you trust them? Lord Berard, sitting in his stone keep, surrounded by roaring hearths and feasting tables, didn't spare a single thought for the human furnaces he ruled over. To him, they were just numbers, tax liabilities that needed to survive until spring to produce the next harvest. But down here in the cold, dark mud, a hidden war was being waged, not against the Lord, but against the very nature of human compassion. The story you are about to witness spans the next 3 agonizing months, where the cost of a single degree of warmth might just be your soul. Get ready, because the true history of survival in medieval France is far more terrifying than any fantasy you've ever heard. This is the first look into the horrifying reality of the shared hearth. Lock your doors, turn up the heat, and prepare yourself. Because once you see the price they paid for survival, you will never look at a cold night the same way again. The winter has begun. The iron boot of winter didn't just step onto the frozen fields of St. Grave. It slammed the heavy wooden door shut behind it, sealing the fate of every soul trapped inside the humble, miserable cottage. Outside, the wind was no longer a natural current of air. It was the howl of a starved wolf, a creature of pure malice,
perpetually licking at the weak mud and wattle walls of the hut, testing their structural integrity with every icy gust. The very darkness seemed to possess a chilling weight, pressing down on the single, sputtering flame in the central hearth, threatening to extinguish the last flicker of organized life in the room.
The smoke, thick and resinous from the damp, inferior wood they were forced to burn, the seasoned, dry timber went straight to the Lord's keep, a tribute to his pointless vanity, clung to the low ceiling like a suffocating shroud, a constant reminder of their compromised existence. Every breath taken inside was a brutal trade-off. Inhale the life-giving warmth, or cough up the lung-burning soot, the residue of their desperation. They called the structure their home, but in truth it was merely the cage where they waited for morning, hoping the cold would choose a different, weaker target tonight. Inside, the family unit, the ancient grandmother Elara, the father Etienne, the mother Marie, and the 3 children, Thomas, Lisette, and little Jean, began the terrible nightly migration towards the central source of life. Etienne moved first, his hands raw and cracked, bleeding from the perpetual, thankless chore of scrounging for fuel in the frozen, unforgiving forest, knowing that every fallen branch was already guarded by a competitor or the Count's brutal game warden. He knew the unspoken horror hanging in the air. If the fire died, they died, and he was the one holding the fragile line between a slow burn and absolute zero, a burden that crushed his soul. The meager store of kindling, carefully stacked in the corner, was guarded more fiercely than any hoard of gold coins, because gold could not melt the ice that was already beginning to form inside a child's chest cavity, tightening the breath. The ritual of the night began with the bedding, a desperate and undignified layering of whatever rough wool scraps, damp straw, or threadbare animal hides they possessed, all piled onto the earth floor near the heat. This was the pivotal, terrifying moment where personal space, dignity, and even familial peace disintegrated entirely, replaced by the primal need for shared heat. 7 human beings had to occupy a space designed for 3, pressed together with a violent necessity that was both deeply repulsive in its intimacy and utterly essential for their collective survival. You did not sleep for comfort in 1100 CE, feudal France. You slept purely for thermodynamics, measuring the effectiveness of your rest in retained calories. If a gap appeared between any 2 bodies, even a space as narrow as a thumb, the cold seized the territory immediately, pushing its icy tendrils into the resulting void, turning warm flesh numb in seconds. It was a silent, agonizing war fought millimeters at a time, every single night, and every single limb was a potential casualty. The weakest link always lay on the periphery. Tonight, by terrible, silent consensus, it was Grandmother Elara, her frail body reduced to brittle sticks by 70 years of hunger and cold, her internal furnace barely registering a flicker. She was placed on the outside edge of the living pile, against the single layer of damp hide that separated them from the raw, freezing earth floor. This was not an act of cruelty born of malice. It was the cruel, unyielding mathematics of survival. Her failing metabolism meant that placing her in the center would risk the collective, as she would only draw heat without contributing enough in return, risking the far more valuable lives of the children, the family's only future. This was the dark calculus of feudal existence. The dead weight, no matter how beloved, had to be strategically positioned to minimize the risk to the engine. Etienne, the father and the ultimate protector, rarely slept soundly. He was the watchman, the sentinel against the creeping death. His eyes, perpetually stinging from the acrid smoke, tracked the slow collapse of the fire, the agonizing, terrifying march of the clock toward the longest hours of the night. Those minutes right before dawn, when the cold reaches its absolute, lethal, bone-crushing peak. He listened not just to the roar of the wind, but to the breathing of his family, the most crucial sound in the universe. Any shift in rhythm, any sudden shallow gasp could signal the terrifying onset of sleep's black kiss, the peasant name for the hypothermia that stole life silently, often starting with the numbing of the extremities. He had to be instantly ready to force movement back into a stiffening limb, to strike the flint, to shake a shoulder back into consciousness. The air was so dense with the combined moisture of bodies, breath, and the cooking fire that the plaster walls themselves wept condensation. Rivulets of water tracked down the interior structure, freezing instantly into sharp crystalline lines if they strayed too far from the direct heat zone. They were, quite literally, living inside an organic block of ice, constantly trying to melt themselves out, expending precious life energy just to maintain stasis. Then came the sound that always shattered the brittle silence of the night, spiking the family's terror. The sharp, sudden crack of the wooden roof beam contracting under the extreme, rapid drop in temperature outside. It sounded exactly like the snap of a major bone, and every time it happened, Marie would involuntarily flinch, imagining the entire structure giving way, burying them all alive in a frozen, muddy tomb. But the cold was only half the threat they faced. The human predators were still circling, demanding their due. Just 2 days prior, the Count's grim-faced steward, Thibault, had ridden through the village, demanding a new, impossibly high tribute of cured meat, and, with staggering cruelty, demanding that all families surrender their secondary blankets for the garrison's winter stock. They called it resource management, a sickening, grotesque euphemism for legalized systemic theft that meant trading the peasants' only chance at warmth for the Count's military comfort. Etienne, in a terrifying act of defiance, had hidden their single precious sheepskin under the loose floorboards near the pigsty, a rebellious act that, if discovered, would mean a public lashing, the confiscation of all food, and certain starvation. Now, compressed together in the terrifying dark,
The true moral cost of the shared warmth became agonizingly clear. Young Thomas, the 8-year-old, restless and twitching in his fitful sleep, had inadvertently shoved his foot, freezing cold from being near the periphery, against his sister Lisette's kidney. She jolted awake, a silent, panicked whimper caught in her throat, instantly terrified by the shock of the cold.
The tiny friction, the small space he temporarily stole, the minute loss of heat caused by his intrusion. It was a betrayal of the collective pact, a tiny wound in their defense. There was absolutely no room for accidents or restlessness in this bed of life. Marie gently shifted her entire body, creating a living, breathing barrier between the two children, sacrificing her own marginal comfort to restore the crucial thermal equilibrium of the whole. This was life in the age of iron and ice. Survival was not a given state, but a continuous, brutal battle where the greatest enemy was not the wolf or the raider, but the simple, unyielding physics of a world determined to drain every single calorie, every precious joule of energy from the human body. They were constantly running a desperate deficit, powered only by sheer fear and the agonizing, fragile hope that the sun would actually rise again. Etienne watched the last ember shrink, a minuscule, desperate eye staring back at the infinite, consuming darkness. He reached out, his hand shaking with exhaustion and dread, and placed the final, precious piece of hoarded wood onto the pyre. The battle for this single, agonizing night had just reached its absolute, critical peak. The splintered dry oak hissed, a sound that in this suffocating darkness was the most beautiful music ever composed, a brief, fragile declaration of war against the ancient enemy. Jean, the patriarch, did not move. His eyes, sunken and red-rimmed from weeks of near sleep, tracked every flicker, calculating the exact agonizing half-life of this final, desperate offering. If this piece failed to ignite fully, if it merely smoldered, the entire night, the entire lineage, was forfeit. The temporary light illuminated the faces huddled around the central pit. 8 souls pressed together like stones, cemented by fear and necessity. Bodies already slick with the sweat of intense, claustrophobic heat sharing. They were living on borrowed minutes now, seconds stolen from the grinding jaws of the winter catastrophe that had already claimed the livestock and the hopes of spring. The air was thick, suffocating, a bizarre cocktail of wood smoke, unwashed wool, and the metallic tang of fear and starvation. Every millimeter mattered. They lived entirely within what they grimly called the line, the absolute, invisible perimeter where the radiant heat of the central fire met the penetrating, bone-deep dampness of the stone and earth hut walls. To cross the line, to stretch out an arm too far, or to shift an exhausted leg even slightly, was to invite the cold to anchor itself instantly into the marrow, a poison injection of frost. Little Marie Shivering, despite being sandwiched between her mother and a sack of moldering grain, let out a small, pitiful moan. It wasn't the sound of a child needing comfort. It was the sound of a body giving up, a tiny mechanical failure in the system, a surrender of the internal thermostat that terrified Jean more than any external win. He immediately reacted, not with tenderness, but with the ruthless efficiency of a captain trying to patch a hole in a sinking ship. "Closer," he rasped, his voice raw from the dry, smoky air. "Pull her tighter, Elodie. We must be one thing, not 8 separate things waiting to freeze." The terrifying truth was a physical ache in his own chest. The cold wasn't just external, it was internal. It had leached the caloric energy they desperately needed to maintain core temperature, energy they hadn't consumed in months, leaving them perpetually hollow. They had reached the grim stage of survival known only in the deepest winters, where the body begins to cannibalize itself, drawing upon muscle and vital organs just to power the involuntary shuddering. The constant seismic tremors of their shared bodies were not a defense, but a surrender, a painful symptom of the slow, inevitable ice rot setting in beneath the skin, a creeping numbness that promised oblivion. He looked at the hands of old Father Thomas, gnarled and purple, the color of bruised plums. The skin was tight, almost transparent, a roadmap of compromised circulation where the cold had permanently constricted the blood vessels, turning lifeblood sluggish and weak. He knew with a terrible certainty that settled like a lead weight that Thomas would not see the thaw. His spirit was already halfway across the line. The wood was a temporary shield, a magnificent, brief illusion of safety. But the true battle was being lost in the belly. Wood provided heat, fat provided fuel. They had run out of fuel weeks ago, surviving only on the meager, sour bread they baked from salvaged wet grain, stretching each mouthful into a moral decision. Every single calorie expended on shivering was a theft from the future, a debt they could never repay. Jean felt the familiar, grinding, agonizing guilt that clawed at his conscience. He had hoarded a single, tiny, blackened piece of bacon rind, wrapped tightly in oilcloth and buried beneath the hearthstones. It was meant for his pregnant daughter, Isabel, a last-ditch infusion of energy for the birth. But the temptation now, the screaming biological imperative to ignite his own failing internal furnace, was a physical violence against his own will. That rind, barely the size of his thumb, represented perhaps 300 precious calories, a colossal, unimaginable amount of energy in this skeletal existence. If he ate it now, he might gain an hour of focus, an hour of strength to feed the pyre, to remain vigilant, but he would be stealing the critical moment of life from his unborn grandchild. That was the terrible calculus of the peasant winter. Every survival choice was a zero-sum equation of familial betrayal. Outside, the wind did not howl. It screamed, a high-pitched mucking shriek that sounded less like weather
and more like the malicious living intent of a demonic entity, searching for gaps in their defense, testing the flimsy thatch and mud walls. The thatch roof, poor and brittle, offered no true resistance to the penetrating cold, which filtered down in icy plumes, settling silently onto the backs of their necks and the crown of their heads.
The light from the oak piece began to steady, burning with a ferocious, bright yellow heart, a temporary miracle of combustion. But this sudden brightness had an unexpected, terrifying consequence. It threw sharper, more defined shadows onto the damp stone walls, transforming the familiar shapes of tools and stored pots into monstrous, looming figures of dread. They saw the shadow of the axe, enormous and exaggerated, looming over them, a silent, terrifying reminder of the desperate, unforgivable decisions that might yet need to be made if the heat truly failed and madness set in. Starvation and cold did not kill cleanly. They stripped away reason and turned kin into desperate competitors for the last scrap of warmth, turning human empathy into a forgotten myth. John swallowed hard, his throat dry as dust. He had heard the dark stories, the terrible whispers that traveled through the villages after the deep frosts, of families collapsing into chaotic, freezing piles, of the strong pushing the weak toward the periphery, toward the line, toward certain, swift death, just to claim a few extra inches of radiant heat for themselves. The fire was now half gone. The glorious yellow flame was already fading toward a dull, sputtering, disheartening red. He knew the simple chemical process. The easy energy of the wood was spent. Now came the long, grinding resistance of the core fibers, the final, excruciating fight against entropy and dissolution. He reached out a hand, not to warm it, but to gauge the distance to the flame, calculating the time remaining until the glow faded and the hut was plunged back into the total, annihilating darkness that swallowed all hope. He had perhaps 45 minutes before the true, lethal chill of the midnight hour descended. 45 minutes before the illusion of safety shattered, and the cold pressed its iron boot down fully upon their collective throat. His gaze fell upon his youngest son, who was nervously chewing on a piece of softened leather strapping, trying to fool his stomach into submission, trying to ignore the hunger pains. The small, ragged, gasping breath of the boy was the ticking clock of their shared doom. Jean had to act, and he had to act now, before the cold seized the last ounce of their collective will. The knife handle felt slick in his palm, slick with his own sweat and dread. The only question was, what was he willing to cut away to buy them another hour? The true test of the night was not the cold. It was the morality that melted away in the heat of survival. Gaston's breath hitched, not from the chill, but from the realization burning hotter than the embers currently sputtering out on the floor. Survival had shed its cloak of heroism long ago, revealing the stark, hideous skeleton beneath. Calculation. He knew what had to be done. The precious hardened oak supports of the common sleeping platform, the very structure holding their fragile existence above the damp earth, were the only dry, dense fuel left. To touch them was to invite the roof itself to collapse, but to not touch them was to guarantee the immediate, frozen death of his youngest daughter, Marie. The wood groaned under the pressure of the sleeping bodies, a low, ominous sound that mirrored the complaint in Gaston's own chest. It wasn't just physical theft. It was stealing from the future, burning the very foundation of their shelter to buy a single, horrifying hour of present heat. He slid out of the huddle, the air biting his exposed skin instantly, a vicious, invisible dog snapping at his ankles. Every muscle protested the movement, knowing that breaking the seal of shared body heat was a catastrophic expenditure of energy. Madame Dubois shifted beside him, her ragged breathing a measure of the fragile peace holding the 6 people together in the dark. If she woke, the accusation in her eyes would be worse than the cold. She knew the rules of the communal warmth. Thou shalt not jeopardize the structural integrity of the shared refuge. But the rules of the night were written in ice, and ice respected no law but 0 degrees. With a rusted, half-dull axe head he kept hidden under the straw, Gaston knelt, feeling the powerful thrum of the solid oak beam. He targeted the peripheral support, the one closest to the door, the one that held the least direct load, or so he prayed to a silent, indifferent God. The first dull thud resonated through the packed earth and through the bones of every person present, even those deep in exhaustion. The axe struck again, a higher, sharper crack, the sound of shattering loyalty. A gasp tore through the darkness. It was young Jacques Dubois, his eyes wide and reflecting the tiny pinprick of firelight, recognizing the sound for what it was. Sabotage. Gaston, what are you doing? Stop. The hiss was low, but carried the immense weight of communal rage. It wasn't the noise that betrayed Gaston. It was the smell. The rich, dry scent of seasoned, life-giving timber being violated. Gaston ignored him, adrenaline surging through his veins, the panic of discovery fighting the primal drive to... Gaston ignored him, adrenaline surging through his veins, the panic of discovery fighting the primal drive to save his own bloodline. He needed 3 solid chunks, 3 thick slices of future life, burned for immediate survival. Jacques scrambled out, moving with the speed of panic, grabbing Gaston's arm. You will bring the house down. Are you mad? We all die if the roof falls. The desperation in the youth's voice was the sound of true terror, the realization that the man who was meant to be their ally had become the greatest threat. Gaston snarled, his voice raw, throwing off the smaller man's grip. We die now if I don't. Look at your sister, man. Her lips are blue. The straw offers nothing more. This is the only way back from the edge of the pit.
Madame Dubois, fully awake now, sat bolt upright, recognizing the awful truth. The conflict wasn't about the wood. It was about the unspoken social contract that binds the huddled poor, mutual reliance. Breaking the structure meant breaking the pact.
But the cold, the true antagonist, had chosen its champion. It had forced Gaston's hand, turning him into a desperate arsonist of his own home. He finished the cut, ripping the splintered timber free. The immediate gaping hole in the platform didn't cause a collapse, but the entire structure settled with a sickening, audible thunk. A shower of frozen mud and thatch rained down from the roof, a warning shot fired by the vengeful structure itself. Gaston shoved the prized dry oak into the embers. It caught instantly, hissing like a serpent, then erupting into a glorious golden blaze. The radiant heat hit the chilled bodies like a physical blow, driving the deep, invasive cold back from their centers. It was the most beautiful, most horrifying fire Gaston had ever witnessed. It was bought with treason and the structural integrity of their collective future. For 5 minutes, the 6 people basked in the intense, life-saving glow, their minds momentarily focused only on the sensation of returning circulation, the pain of the cold receding like a bad memory. But the relief quickly curdled. The Dubois family, the mother, the son, and the frail daughter huddled tighter, their eyes fixed on the gaping wound in the floor, the missing beam standing sentinel in the fire pit, now providing the only warmth in the room. They understood the transaction. Gaston had saved his family at their expense. If the wind picked up, if the snow load increased, their shared shelter was now fatally compromised, all for a temporary warmth that felt like poison in their lungs. The terrible silence that followed the fire's establishment was louder than any scream. It was the sound of a foundational bond snapping, of shared misery giving way to isolated terror. The night was conquered, but the morning would bring a far greater threat than freezing. It would bring judgment. The Dubois family knew they could not stay. Sharing warmth with a man who would burn the house down to keep his own child alive was no longer survival. It was complicity in their own eventual ruin. As the oak beams slowly turned to ash, granting them perhaps 3 hours of blessed searing heat, Gaston watched the dark forms across the floor. He hadn't just secured the night. He had irrevocably severed the chain of communal life. He had bought his family time, yes, but he had purchased it with the currency of exile and dread. The true cost of the warmth was the horrifying certainty that come dawn, 2 families would have to walk out into the killing frost alone, enemies forged in the heat of a burning piece of wood. The moment the first sliver of weak, pathetic light dared to pierce the single grimy window hole of the shared hovel, a collective, visceral groan escaped the 12 souls huddled inside. It wasn't the groan of waking. It was the sound of a prisoner realizing the jail door was opening, leading only to a colder, wider cell. The fire, the relentless, miraculous heart of their survival, had finally collapsed into a smoking ruin of ash and despair. The cold, which had been merely a menacing shadow during the night, instantly materialized, sinking its sharp, invisible teeth deep into exposed skin. It was a physical thing, a heavy, suffocating blanket of frost that promised death within hours if they remained inert. Every single person, from the elder farmer Jean Dubois to the infant wrapped tightly in rags, knew the rules. The moment the shared heat vanished, the truce was over. The weapons, their eyes, were drawn. Marie, the mother of the Dubois family, didn't even look at the neighboring Leroux clan. Her gaze was locked on the small, pitiful pile of remaining unsplit kindling resting near the door, the spoils of last week's near-fatal forest excursion. That wood was their future. That wood was life insurance against the next 48 hours of glacial terror. The agreement whispered in fevered desperation the night before. Share the heat, but the remaining resources belonged strictly to the original inhabitants, was a paper agreement, easily incinerated by the morning's necessity. Agreements made in the terrifying euphoria of warmth rarely survive the sober light of a freezing day.
Old Man Leroux, a gaunt shadow of a man whose bones felt like splintered ice, pushed himself to his feet, a move that sent a tremor of fear through the small space. His eyes, sunken and bloodshot, were fixed not on the wood, but on Marie's children, their chests rattling with the deep, wet coughs of the winter fever.
He wasn't looking at the future supply. He was assessing the current demand, the immediate weakness. How many mouths needed feeding before they could start thinking about the next fire? Jean Dubois cleared his throat, a dry, rattling sound that tasted of dust and cold, a desperate attempt to assert control over the situation. "The sun is up, neighbor," Dubois stated, his voice thick with enforced civility. "The path is clear. May God grant you speed and safety on your walk." A silence heavier than the winter air filled the space. It was the moment of judgment, the time when humanity dissolved back into the primal hunger for survival. Leroux did not move. He planted his frozen feet firmly on the packed earth floor. "Clear path, Dubois? You call that a clear path? My boy, young Thomas, he coughed blood through the night. He needs strength. He needs sustenance, a real portion of sustenance, before he faces the Baron's frozen fields this morning." This wasn't just about sharing a crust of stale bread. This was about forcing a moral trade, weaponizing illness against their hosts. Leroux was leveraging his son's weakness as a brutal form of blackmail against Dubois' desperate need to be rid of them before the sun rose higher and the true workday began. Dubois knew the ruthless code of survival demanded he ignore the plea, demanded he protect his own stores. Yet the collective memory of the night's shared breath, the agonizing intimacy of shared fear, made outright refusal feel like an act of spiritual execution. Thomas will recover," Dubois stated, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, a dangerous mask of control. "But the Baron's overseer, he will not wait. We both know the punishment for tardiness in the levy collection, and we both know the weight of the whip." The levy, that horrifying, soul-crushing word. The tax demanded not in coin, but in harvested grain that they barely possessed themselves, extracted with an efficiency that defied the laws of physics. Every ounce of effort expended in the Baron's frozen fields meant an ounce less energy for their own meager patch, an ounce less resilience against the inevitable, terminal cold that awaited them. It was the iron vice of feudal oppression, squeezing the life out of them, slowly, methodically, year after brutal year. Suddenly, Leroux's wife, Ilara, a woman usually silent, whose grief seemed to have frozen her tongue years ago, made a swift, predatory move. Her hand shot out, not toward the bread, but toward the very small, heavy, greasy sack of salted fish guts Dubois had carefully preserved, the single most concentrated source of protein they possessed for the entire week. It was a desperate gamble, a sign that civility was utterly abandoned, a declaration of war waged over 3 handfuls of life-giving, rancid fat. Dubois roared, a sound torn from deep within his chest, half anger, half pure terror at the catastrophic loss. He lunged, knocking the small, frail woman back against the cold stone wall. The sack tumbled, scattering the precious, frozen, salty fragments onto the dirt floor, mixing instantly with the dust, the damp, and the ancient mouse droppings. Catastrophe, food contamination, wasted energy. The physical fight wasn't worth the cost. Yet now it had started, it couldn't be stopped, not without a decisive victor. Leroux seized a heavy, iron-tipped shovel used for banking the embers and lifted it high above his head, the metal glinting menacingly in the weak light. "You strike my wife, Dubois? After we shared the fear of the night? You are less than the ice itself," he shrieked, the sound cracking his throat. The confrontation, however violent in intent, died instantly the moment the shovel was raised, and the sound echoed too loudly. The sheer noise of the struggle was a beacon, a signal to any patrolling guards, or worse, competing, starving families hiding in the surrounding hostile forest. They had violated the first sacred rule of survival: be silent, be invisible. Dubois dropped his hands, panting, staring at the scattered, irreplaceable food on the floor, the dirt rendering it useless. He knew the fight was pointless. They were both broken men, staring down the barrel of the same inevitable fate. He pointed a trembling finger at the single, larger piece of kindling, the solid, thick starter log that could guarantee a future flame. "Take it," Dubois spat, the word tasting like ash and defeat. "Take that piece, get out, and pray to God you find something, anything, to trade for it by the next full moon, or I swear by the graves of my ancestors, I will come for the debt. The debt of wood is the debt of life, LaRue.
LaRue hesitated, momentarily stunned by the magnitude of the exchange. This wasn't charity. It was a devastating curse, a guaranteed future obligation that would haunt his steps through the entire winter, forcing him to take suicidal risks to procure payment.
But the life-saving potential of that single log outweighed the terror of the debt. He snatched the wood, tucked it tightly under his arm, and without another word or a backward glance, he herded his shivering, defeated family out into the deadly morning air.
The door slammed shut, plunging the Dubois family back into a silence colder and more profound than before. They were alone. They were safe from immediate conflict, but they were now creditors in the most brutal market known to man, the market of survival. The wood was gone, but the debt remained, a sharp, invisible knife hanging over two families, waiting for the full moon to signal the payment deadline. The frost outside was merely killing them slowly. The debt inside was killing them fast.
And Dubois had only just realized the sickening truth. He had traded a piece of wood for a target painted squarely on his back. The antagonist wasn't the cold anymore. It was the man who owed him life, and who would soon realize that paying the debt was impossible. The air inside the smoke-clogged longhouse had thickened into a physical barrier, not just against the winter, but against the truth. Every cough, every shift of weight on the shared straw pallet was a calculated move in a game only Thibault understood the rules of. He watched Gaspard's profile, illuminated by the dying, exhausted embers of the communal hearth, seeing not a neighbor, but a ticking liability, a borrowed asset whose cost of maintenance was now bankrupting the entire operation.
The children, piled together like sacks of grain for shared, desperate warmth, breathed the heavy, fetid air, their innocence the only remaining currency of purity in the wretched, suffocating space. The single small window slit, covered by a mica-thin sheet of scraped horn or oiled linen, offered no light, only a phantom promise of the bone-shattering doom lurking just outside the fragile wattle and daub walls. Gaspard knew he was being measured. He felt the weight of Thibault's gaze like the iron collar of the local baron, tightening with every passing, starving hour that extended the winter's grip. The debt was no longer just the few handfuls of oats he had received. It was the space he occupied, the meager, precious heat he stole from the fire, the oxygen he breathed that could have gone to a more productive, more valuable set of lungs. In the ruthless, zero-sum economy of 1100 CE survival, a single healthy adult body represented a terrifying monetary value, potential labor for the Lord, a future yield of grain, a fighting chance against the inevitability of the sickness that stalked the crowded communal quarters.
Gaspard had foolishly traded that future value for immediate, agonizing survival during the worst blizzard the region had seen in a generation.
Thibault had extended him credit, a scant measure of preserved winter oats, a piece of dry, gray salt pork the size of a pigeon's heart, and 3 critical nights sleeping closest to the central pit where the fire crackled, a spot usually reserved for the most venerable elder. That warmth, that prime placement in the thermal gradient of the house was life itself, alone secured against his soul.
But the ancient, mythological antagonist, the cold, had dragged its iron boot longer than anyone dared to predict. The oats were gone, metabolized into desperate heat. The salt pork was a faded, cruel memory. And the promise of Gaspard's spring labor, the corvée debt owed to Thibault, was now utterly worthless, because Thibault barely had enough resources to keep his own family functioning, let alone feed a dependent for 3 more agonizing, soul-crushing months.
The cold hadn't just lowered the temperature of the air. It had surgically lowered the moral ceiling of the human spirit. Thibault watched his youngest daughter shiver beneath the threadbare blanket, the perpetual damp clinging to her lungs like a curse. He calculated the energy Gaspard consumed, the finite calories that could have been surgically diverted to save the child.
The mathematics of survival were brutally simple, mandated by the cold and signed in frost upon the long house roof. 1 life must be subtracted from the equation so that 4 could continue the horrific calculation. This wasn't murder, he reasoned, his hand blindly gripping the rough, cold handle of his small wood axe hidden beneath the straw. This was triage, mandated by the very laws of the universe, and the Baron's terrifying, absolute indifference.
He faintly recalled the priest's words about Christian charity, but the words felt like ashes and dry dust in his mouth, mocking the reality of his situation. Charity was a frivolous luxury of the fleeting summer, a philosophical distraction reserved for those with overflowing barns and fat bellies. In the suffocating, claustrophobic reality of the longhouse, charity was simply a drain, a direct and suicidal route to mutual annihilation.
The shared sleep was the most vulnerable hour in the entire day. The moment the guard dropped and the body gave itself over to the terrifying necessity of rest. 30 souls packed spine to spine on the earthen floor, inhaling the mingled stench of fear, damp wool, cow manure from the adjoining stall, and bodies that hadn't known real soap in months. It was the only viable way to harvest enough kinetic heat to cheat the relentless frost. But it also transformed the longhouse into a cage of inescapable, lethal proximity.
Thibault waited for the slow, heavy breathing of true, deep unconsciousness to settle over the room. The ragged, hypnotic rhythm that meant the bodies were conserving every ounce of stored energy. He needed the darkness to be absolute, the silence profound. But that silence was a ghost that never truly arrived in the longhouse.
There was always the grunt of the pig
separated by the thin woven hurdle, the lowing complaint of the ox, or the terrifying, wet, rattling cough of the neighbor's child, signaling that the white death of the fever or the black death of the rot was knocking again at the door of their fragile lives. Tonight, however, the only sound that mattered was the steady, rhythmic, mesmerizing beat of Gaspard's heart. A biological drum counting down the last seconds of his accidental stay on Earth. He pushed himself up, not using his arms, but leveraging his weight slowly and agonizingly from his hip, inch by excruciating inch, a stealthy process that took nearly 5 eternal minutes just to reach a kneeling position. The rough, dry straw rustled beneath him. The sound, amplified by the heavy quiet of the exhausted room, seemed to explode like an avalanche right next to the hearth.
Thibaut froze, his breath catching painfully in his throat, listening for any shift in the breathing patterns around him. His wife, Marie, didn't stir, having long ago perfected the art of chemically induced unconsciousness brought on by utter, paralyzing exhaustion and starvation. He slowly, agonizingly reached for the crude axe he had secured, his fingers finding the familiar, rough grooves of the worn wood handle. The cold steel head felt impossibly heavy, weighted not just by dense iron, but by the horrific, paralyzing necessity driving him toward this unforgivable act. He had been a good man, a loyal subject, a loving father. This single action was simply the necessary price of remaining all those things in a world defined only by its brutal, uncompromising cruelty.
He calculated the 3 short steps needed to cross the small, terrible gap between his palate and the exposed, vulnerable side of Gaspard's sleeping head. 3 steps that would ultimately decide the fate of 2 desperate families and define the exact limits of human debt in the face of the ultimate predator, the winter. The silence that followed those 3 fateful steps was not empty. It was a pressurized vacuum, humming with the static energy of 2 families about to fracture. Gaspard's wife, Ilara, held her breath, the smell of damp straw and unwashed wool clogging her lungs. But the scent of impending catastrophe was far sharper. She knew, with the cold certainty of a starving wolf, that the fire, their communal god, was dying a slow, agonizing death in the stone hearth just feet away. The single remaining log, gnarled and dense oak, salvaged from a wind-felled giant months ago, lay waiting. It was a king on a chopping block. It represented perhaps 2 hours of survivable heat, 2 hours of holding the winter's iron grip, just slightly at bay. Every breath drawn by the family of Mathis, huddled closer than legally permissible to the core heat source, was an act of theft against Gaspard's dwindling lifespan. This wasn't just wood. This was the physical manifestation of their collective future, and it was disappearing into ash and smoke. A tragic, ephemeral sacrifice to the ancient, unrelenting cold.
Feudal law dictated that only the Lord owned the deep forest, but survival law dictated that the strongest hand claimed the remnant. And right now, the strongest hand belonged to the person willing to wait the longest, the one who could endure the deepest, most excruciating chill before making the ultimate move.
The initial agreement, forged back in the early autumn, when the cold was merely a nuisance, was based on mutual necessity and shared obligation, a promise of reciprocal existence. Now, that promise was a rotten rope snapping under the immense weight of the deep freeze.
Gaspard remembered the meager sack of dried peas Matisse had shared 3 weeks prior, a gesture of camaraderie that now felt less like generosity and more like a carefully calculated investment in prime real estate next to the fire. He was paying the interest now, paid in the shivering proximity of his own children to the icy, mud-packed wall.
The problem was the sheer logistics of survival. The warmth radiated outward in diminishing returns, a cruel inverse square law of thermal energy. The core 4 feet were life. The outer 6 feet were merely a slightly slower death. Then came the sound, a sound that, in the cavernous silence of their shared misery, detonated like a thunderclap. Mathis shifted, a sudden, deliberate movement that scraped rough wool against straw matting, and then his calloused hand, thick and scarred from decades of agricultural servitude, reached out. It didn't reach for the log. It reached for the smallest, most vulnerable thing near the heat. The small iron pot where they kept the water from freezing solid. He moved it closer, protecting his portion of the communal resource, guaranteeing his family's hydration at the expense of communal thermal efficiency. This subtle act of territorial demarcation was a declaration of war, fought not with swords, but with ounces of thermal energy. Elara watched, her heart hammering against her ribs like a prisoner demanding release, understanding immediately the implication. Mathis was prioritizing the preservation of his hydration over the immediate infusion of heat from the last log. He was betting on a longer, grim game, a sign he believed they had hours, not minutes. The winter, that invisible, omnipresent tyrant, was not merely attacking their skin, it was dissecting their ethics. It was whispering insidious doubts into the ears of every father and mother present, asking, "How much warmth are you willing to steal to save your blood?" Gaspard felt the familiar, paralyzing ache start in his extremities, the tiny, stinging needles of impending frostbite serving as his body's meticulous accountant, detailing every degree lost. He knew that the moment he moved to shift the log, the moment he crossed that invisible line of established debt, Mathis would interpret it as an ultimate betrayal. The log sat there, radiating its final, magnificent warmth, yet neither man dared touch it. It was the lever that could tilt the balance, but to grasp it meant accepting the mantle of antagonist in this slow-motion tragedy of survival. It meant admitting the ritual of shared humanity had failed entirely.
Meanwhile, the roof of the small hut, a patchwork of hastily gathered reeds and mud-daubed sticks, groaned under the accumulating weight of the snow that had not stopped falling for 3 solid days. Every creak was a reminder that their fragile shelter was perpetually one structural failure away from burying them alive in a frozen tomb.
The ceiling was the weakest point in their defense against the elemental fury. Tiny, microscopic fissures in the thatch acted like thermal sluices, draining the precious, banked heat up and out into the murderous night sky. Gaspard's oldest son, young Etienne, stirred, whimpering softly, his body instinctively seeking the denser, warmer mass of his father's back. Etienne was the catalyst. The father must act for the son, and the memory of dried peas was instantly erased by the sound of his child's desperate shudder. Gaspard's hand, rigid and pale, finally moved. It was not a violent motion, but a slow, calculated outreach towards the last log, a silent promise to his shivering child that the payment of peas was now complete, and the debt settled in ice. Mathis's eyes, which had been feigning the deep sleep of the innocent, snapped open with predatory speed. They were not the eyes of a neighbor, but the hard, judgmental orbs of a creditor whose payment was being defaulted upon. His breath hissed out, a sharp, cold sound that cut through the stuffy warmth.
Gaspard, he whispered, the name itself sounding like a judgment delivered from the grave. That log was meant to last the hour until dawn. You know we must stretch it, or we lose the morning cook fire entirely.
Gaspard met his gaze, the dim orange flicker of the burning wood reflecting the desperate, unblinking intensity of his resolve. We lose the night, Matisse, and the morning fire will be needed only to thaw our corpses, he returned, his voice rough with disuse and the sudden, adrenaline-fueled confrontation.
He shoved the log onto the embers. The fire roared, a brief, triumphant explosion of life, throwing sharp, dancing shadows across the terrified faces of the children and the calculating faces of the adults. The warmth immediately surged, but it was a warmth purchased at an unforgivable price.
The surge was glorious, a momentary reprieve that flushed the gray pallor from their faces and chased the stinging ache from their bones. It was a sensation akin to surviving a mortal wound, but everyone understood the brutal arithmetic. This sudden, magnificent luxury had just shortened their overall survival window by eliminating their reserve. Mathis didn't move, but the tension radiating from his huddled form was palpable, a silent threat more potent than any drawn knife. His wife, Agnes, who had been silently weeping beneath a scrap of blanket, pulled her children tighter, physically shielding them from the new heat, a bizarre gesture that suggested she feared the cost more than the cold itself. In this age, where medical knowledge was superstition and survival was pure mathematics, the peasants understood cold better than any scholar. They knew the deceptive, glorious warmth that came just before the end, the strange, calming sleep that signaled the arrival of the walking ghost Death. And they knew this fire surge was a dangerous flirtation with that line.
Gaspar refused to look away. His defiance was not born of strength, but of the absolute necessity of fatherhood, a primal scream for survival. He had chosen the longevity of his own bloodline over the fragile peace of their shared shelter.
The unspoken contract was shredded. From this moment forward, the huddle was no longer a sanctuary of mutual aid. It was a contested battlefield, a zero-sum game played out in the diminishing radiance of a single burning piece of wood. He watched Mathis's face, etched with a bitter, cold calculation. Mathis was already planning the retaliatory move, the counter-strike that would reclaim the thermal advantage Gaspar had just stolen. Perhaps it would be the water pot again. Perhaps the subtle repositioning of a child's foot slightly too close to the hearthstones. Or perhaps something darker. The fire burned, illuminating the new reality. Two families, bound by desperation, now separated by an uncrossable chasm of mistrust, breathing the same air, yet inhabiting different, hostile worlds. The true battle was not against the frost outside, but against the primal, tearing instinct inside the fragile walls of the hut. The night was still young, and the last log, though now roaring, promised a rapid descent back into the bone-crushing chill within the next 90 minutes. The 3 steps Gaspar had taken hours earlier had led them here, to this moment of magnificent, horrifying warmth and total, catastrophic moral collapse.